I'm delighted to be back in Baltimore. I like to believe that the turnout tonight reflects a desire to welcome a former Baltimorean home, but I realize realistically that it is the topic that I'm to talk about, namely the United States and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the role of the Bush administration. I think you indeed have been extraordinary in your timing. When I talked to my former schoolmate, John Chittenden, about coming over here as far back as last summer, we talked in very general terms. When Dr. Byrd suggested I come over 3 or 4 months ago, we picked this date in April, a little realizing that April really has been the Middle East week in Washington, and there's been a spin-off effect of that here in Baltimore in that President Mubarak of Egypt came over to watch the Baltimore Orioles in the opening game. The thing I want to do tonight, 4 things really. First is to give a bit of background on the issues that the Bush administration will face, or has faced, I should say, when it took office in January. Second, I'd like to talk about the Bush administration's first 3 months. Third, and again quickly, to lay out some of the issues, problems, players that the administration will deal with in the Middle East. And fourth, and perhaps riskily, and I hope not too pontifically, lay out some thoughts I have as to a possible ultimate settlement of this problem, which has gone on now for more than 40 years. Let me say, before I talk about the last 3 months, I should note that when a new administration takes office in Washington, no matter what the administration is, there's a tendency of the so-called experts on the outside to be critical of the new team, and stories about the lack of knowledge of the new team circulate quickly. And the Bush administration has been no exception. There's a story in Washington which may be apocryphal, on the other hand it may not be, which suggests that earlier in the year, when there was talk about scheduling the visits of the 3 Middle East leaders to Washington this month, namely President Mubarak of Egypt, Prime Minister Shamir of Israel, and King Hussein of Jordan, a member of the State Department Protocol Office was talking to the new Middle East expert, senior level in the White House. And the protocol man said, in scheduling these visits, it's very important that we have Mubarak here before Ramadan, whereupon the new NSC man said, "Who's Ramadan?" Let me provide, if I may, a bit of background, and if you'll bear with me, let me tick off very quickly 4 key dates which I think are important in putting the present situation in perspective. And to make it easier for me to remember them and you, let me say that each of these 4 dates ends with a 7. 1947, 1967, 1977, 1987. In 1947, in November, after the British had decided they could no longer maintain the mandate over Palestine because of the rising conflict between the Arabs who were in the Palestine Mandate area and the increasing number of Jews who were coming in to the new, what they hoped to be the new state of Israel, threw the question into the United Nations, and the United Nations in late 1947 voted to partition the former mandate into 2 states, State of Israel and an Arab-Palestinian state, with Jerusalem to be internationalized. Those who were pushing, the Zionists who were pushing for a Jewish state, reluctantly accepted the partition resolution. The Arabs, however, turned it down, arguing that Israel was being imposed by outside colonial powers in the area of Arab Palestine, and second, that the amount of territory to be given to the Arab state was out of proportion to the number of Arabs in the area. But the resolution passed 2-1, with the Western powers supporting it, with all of the Arab countries then in the United Nations and all of the Third World countries opposing it. After that partition resolution in 1948, you'll recall that the State of Israel was formed in March. Fighting broke out very shortly thereafter between the new State of Israel and the Arab countries surrounding it, resulting in armistice agreements in early 1949. You had at that time Israel in control of about 1/4 more territory than it would have received had the Arabs accepted the partition resolution. As a result of the fighting, Jordan held on to what was most of the West Bank of the Jordan River, and Egypt the Gaza Strip. The next date that's critical is, of course, June 1947, when, with extraordinary military skill, the Israeli army, in less than a week, in 6 days, defeated the combined armies of Syria, of Jordan, and Egypt. Israel at that time took the West Bank from Jordan, took East Jerusalem from Jordan, took the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and in addition captured the entire very large Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights area between northern Israel and Syria. In November of 1967, the United Nations passed unanimously a resolution known as Resolution 242, which basically called for two things. First, the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the territories, not all the territories, it simply said territories occupied in the Six-Day War, and the acceptance of the State of Israel within secure and recognized boundaries. And this is the well-known Territory for Peace resolution. Israeli withdrawal on one hand, peace on the other. And that resolution, 242, has been the centerpiece of U.S. policy for the succeeding 22 years. The third date that is important, I think, you can pick any number of dates, but I picked these four partly because the 7 is easy to remember. It was 1977. That was the year, you remember, when Anwar Sadat surprised the world by actually making a visit to Israel, speaking before the Knesset, and as a result of the Sadat visit in 1977, we had the Camp David Accords in Washington with Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat, and in March of 1979, we had a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, the first and only peace treaty between an Arab state and Israel, and as a result of that, ambassadors were exchanged between the two countries, and Egypt withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula, which it had taken in 1967. What's that? Excuse me. Israel withdrew from the territory it had taken in 1967. Excuse me. So there was basically diplomatic relations established between Egypt and Israel, and Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai, and was turned back to Egypt at that time. The fourth date is 1987. A little more than a year, not quite a year and a half ago, when in December you had the beginning of the Intifada, the uprisings on the West Bank and Gaza. These uprisings surprised just about everybody in the international community. They certainly surprised the Israeli political and military leaders. They surprised the other Arab states, and they surprised the United States. The riots were the direct result of the hatred and fury built up by the roughly 1.5 million Palestinian Arabs who had lived under Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza for almost 22 years, for approximately 21 years. The Intifada was driven by frustration that the world at large, including the Arab states, had ignored Arab interests and the Arab cause. These were spontaneous uprisings within the territories, and the driving force had been Palestinian youths, many of whom, because of their age, often they were in their teens or early 20s, had no memory at all of the period of Jordanian control of the West Bank or Egyptian control of the Gaza Strip. The result of the uprisings and the Intifada still going on has been that there has been intense communal conflict verging on civil war involving Israel and the occupied territories. It's estimated that approximately 430 Palestinians have been killed, some 17 Israelis, over 7,000 Palestinians have been arrested, a number have been deported, houses have been leveled, press censorship is put into place, and there has been a major effort on the part of the Israeli government, unsuccessful to date, to quell the rebellion. And what we have seen and what we're seeing today is two nations, two distinct peoples, the Israeli Jews and the Palestinian Arabs, fighting over the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which both people feel should be their own, either in totality or in part. It is a battle between two separate nationalities for control of the same piece of land. Now, what happened last year was that once this uprising got underway, the Reagan administration, which had been rather relaxed about the Middle East through most of its time in office, saw that the status quo was upset, and George Shultz took 4 trips to the Middle East in an effort to try to find a solution to the problem. He had general support from Mubarak in Egypt, general support from Foreign Minister Perez, who was then Foreign Minister of Israel under a coalition government. He, however, came into it much too late in the game, and he was unable to meet with any Palestinians on that trip. So the Shultz initiative, while perhaps warranted, it certainly was warranted given the situation at the time, failed basically because it came too late in the game and did not have the substantive ingredients which would have assured success. Now, Shultz was limited in talking with the Palestinians because the United States since 1975 has, as a matter of policy, said that it would not negotiate with members of the Palestine Liberation Organization unless the PLO recognized the existence of the State of Israel, accepted Resolution 242 of November 1967, and thirdly was added a renunciation of terrorism. And since the PLO insisted that the Palestinians not meet with Shultz, he was not able to meet with them on his trips to the Middle East. At the same time, I think it is clear that the overwhelming number of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and there are roughly 1.5 million of them, look to the Palestine Liberation Organization with its headquarters outside of the West Bank and Gaza, for leadership and as an organization which reflects the aspirations of the Palestinians. And it was because of a recognition that the PLO, in fact, was the spokesman for the Palestinians that King Hussein of Jordan made the dramatic announcement last July that he would disengage from the West Bank, even though the Israelis had had effective control over the West Bank since 1967. Nonetheless, Jordan, by financial assistance, by giving passports to the West Bankers, by administrative support, was deeply engaged in the West Bank up until last summer. But Hussein said, in effect, it's obvious to me that the Palestinians do not look to me, Hussein, for leadership, therefore I am disengaging from the West Bank. And he, in fact, cut many of the Jordanian ties. The Intifada itself, which began in December 1987, and the withdrawal of Hussein and Jordan from the West Bank, put enormous pressure on the Palestine Liberation Organization, most of whose officers live outside the West Bank and Gaza, to come up with a political formula that was acceptable to the people inside the occupied territories. And in Algeria, last November, the Palestine National Council, which is the legislative body, if you will, for the PLO, made a major shift and in fact accepted Resolution 242 explicitly. At the same time, they established a separate Palestinian state, or they called for the establishment of a separate Palestinian state. That move by the Palestinians in Algiers, however, was not enough for the administration in Washington. And as you'll remember, George Shultz denied a visa to Yasser Arafat, chairman of the PLO, to come to the United Nations last fall, and instead, last year, and instead, the United Nations met in a special session in Geneva. Arafat's speech to the General Assembly did not still meet the three criteria of Washington, whereupon, with the prompting and the help of Swedish diplomats, the next day we were able to get Arafat at a press conference in Geneva to utter what had been known as the magic words, namely, that the Palestine Liberation Organization accepts the State of Israel, accepts Resolution 242, and denounces terrorism. Within 5 hours of that, the United States itself responded, saying the criteria had met, and talks were opened in Tunisia between the U.S. ambassador and the Palestine Liberation Organization. This was a major favor, if you will, of the Reagan administration to the Bush administration during the transition period, in the sense that it was a very, very politically sensitive subject, but by beginning talks under the Reagan administration with the Palestine Liberation Organization, the way was paved toward the Bush administration taking office in January in a situation in which there was dialogue already underway. Looking at the Bush administration and this problem as of January of this year, let me just note that the Middle East has often been called an area of lost opportunities. If only we'd done this at such and such a time, we would have not run into the problems and the wars that have plagued that area subsequently. 5 wars in all since the creation of Israel. But I think it is also relevant to note that while there have been missed opportunities, there have been also a number of opportunities which have been seized. And the fact is that no Israeli-Arab agreement over the past 40 years has been achieved without significant American engagement. The United States has played an important role in every major settlement in the Near East over the last 40 years. Therefore, in my judgment, President Bush is in an unusually favorable position to help toward the peace process with two provisos. Provided he places the Middle East high on his foreign policy agenda early in his administration, and he has done that to date. And second, provided that he and his administration provide sustained high-level interest and support in the peace process. Thus far, the Bush administration has met those two criteria. Certainly, the Middle East issue has been high on the agenda, and there has been sustained interest. Where do we stand now in April, the Middle East month, after successive visits to the United States by President Mubarak of Egypt, Prime Minister Shamir of Israel, and King Hussein of Jordan? I would say that the most important visit from the point of view of the peace process was Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, who represents the Likud within the coalition in Israel, which, as contrasted with the Labor Party, has taken generally a more, quote, hardline position than the Labor Party, which has been in coalition with the Likud since 1984. But Shamir was under pressure coming to Washington to come up with a new initiative. And his initiative was to provide for elections in the West Bank and Gaza to select Palestinians who will negotiate with Israel regarding an interim autonomy arrangements for the territories. And after an interim period of autonomy, a second set of negotiations will begin, looking toward a decision as to how to work out the final status of the territories. A two-stage process: elections, limited autonomy, second set of talks looking toward permanent status. At the same time, while making this offer, Shamir has refused to deal with the Palestine Liberation Organization, which he denounces as a terrorist organization, and he also continues to reject UN Resolution 242. The Likud argument is that the territorial withdrawal provisions of 242 took place when Israel withdrew from the Sinai following the Egyptian-Israeli agreement, and therefore no other territorial compromise would be necessary. Likud sees the West Bank and Gaza, as you know, as part of Eretz Israel, as part of Greater Israel. So despite the election offer, there are still the two positions of the Likud government that, of course, could cause problems in the months ahead. And it is for that reason that the Palestinians have reacted generally negatively to the election process. It is for this reason that the Palestinians, to date at least, have not responded positively to the Shamir election proposals. The Bush administration, however, has reacted positively. And I think with good reason, because I think the administration sees these proposals as a way of getting the peace process started. They recognize the problems that the Palestinians have in the sense that they are uncertain about where the elections will lead. But from the point of view of the Bush administration, you now have a proposal on the table from Shamir. You have the possibility of counter-proposals from the Palestinians. And very important, you have a new situation as of December of last year, in that the United States is now in dialogue with both Israel and the Palestinians, recognizing the point I made earlier that no major agreement has occurred in the Middle East without U.S. involvement. Now, Shimon Peres, when Shamir was here in Washington, said, in effect, Israel will be dealing indirectly through the United States with the Palestine Liberation Organization. And he was correct. Because I'm sure, although I haven't talked to my old friends recently, I'm sure people in the State Department are looking over all kinds of formulae for elections, and what will happen, or what is happening, is that the Israeli proposal for elections will be put to the Palestinians through the American ambassador Bob Pelletreau in Tunis, and the reaction to that will be fed back through Washington to Jerusalem. So the important thing is that we have moved into a situation in which the United States is in effect an honest broker between the Palestinians, or the PLO, and the Israelis. Let me go to the third set of points I wanted to talk about, namely, if this is where we are after 3 months of the Bush administration, what will be the issues, the problems, the players ahead during the balance of the Bush administration, whether it be a one-term administration or a two-term administration? I would say there are 5 or 6 elements that the Bush administration will have to deal with. One is the domestic political equation. The other is the coalition government in Israel. The third is dealing with the Palestine Liberation Organization. The fourth is key Arab states. The fifth is the European Economic Community. And last, but by no means necessarily least, the Soviet Union. Very quickly, the domestic political equation is obviously critical to the success of the Bush administration or any other administration, given the ultra-sensitivity of the Israeli-Palestinian issue or the Arab-Israeli issue in American domestic politics. Let me give you an example of the asymmetry in terms of the political arithmetic. Last November, when George Shultz denied Yasser Arafat a visa to come to New York to the General Assembly, the General Assembly went on record urging Shultz to reconsider. The vote in the General Assembly was 151 to 2. That same week, 68 American senators went on record supporting Shultz in denying the visa. This, I think, gives you a rather dramatic picture of the international and the domestic arithmetic of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So it is essential that Bush maintain domestic political support. Now, several things are happening that make this perhaps more promising than the past. There has definitely been a significant shift in American public opinion over the last 15 or 16 months, and that includes a significant shift in the opinion of members of the American Jewish community, many of whom are divided on this issue as to whether or not they can support the position taken by Yitzhak Shamir and the Likud government. So, as a result of the Intifada, you have had several things happen. One, you had the people within the West Bank and Gaza putting pressure on the Palestine Liberation Organization outside. And remember that a majority of Palestinians live outside the West Bank and Gaza. About 60% live outside. They live in Jordan, they live in Syria, they live in Lebanon, they live in Kuwait. You've got Palestinians in prominent positions here. Mr. Mohammed Hadid, who is rumored to take over Eastern Airlines, is a Palestinian, I believe, by background. You have Palestinians in the diaspora, many of whom in the past took a very hard-line position on the so-called two-state solution, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. But as a result of the Intifada and as a result of Hussein's disengagement from the West Bank, the leadership came around to supporting 242 and, in essence, a two-state solution. So you do have, in the United States, much more favorable public opinion, favorable in terms of active American involvement in the peace process than one had before. This does not mean that the administration should not underline unequivocally the basic principle of American foreign policy that has been there from the beginning, and that is American unyielding, unequivocal support for the security of the State of Israel. But the political equation here, domestic political scene, is one factor. The second factor is dealing with a very difficult situation in Israel, where you have a coalition government, Prime Minister Likud, and the Likud party, generally more conservative, wanting to hold on to the West Bank and Gaza. The Labor Party, which only lost narrowly last November, willing to consider some type of territorial compromise. It's very difficult to get a fix on Israeli public opinion because it depends a great deal on how the questions are asked and when they're asked. Experts on the Israeli political scene believe that in Israel today there are about 20% of the electorate which can be characterized as, quote, mature hawks, 10% mature doves, 70% undecided. But if you put a question to the Israeli electorate, asked whether, if they were assured that Arafat meant what he said on the three magic words in Geneva, then about 50% of the Israeli electorate, according to the polls, would be willing to open a dialogue with the PLO. This does not mean, of course, they'd accept a Palestinian state, but they would be willing to open a dialogue with the PLO. There is concern on the part of many Israelis, and it's shared by people in the United States concerned about Israel, both members of the Jewish community and others, that if Israel holds on to the occupied territories long into the future, there will be, in fact, a threat to Israeli democracy and to the nature of the Jewish state. It's estimated, for example, that if present demographic trends continue, by the year 2010, the Jews will constitute only 45% of what is now Israel proper, West Bank, and Gaza. So there are a number of people in Israel and outside who believe that some type of territorial compromise, therefore, is critically important. The PLO, again, the Bush administration will be dealing with an organization which, while disparate in terms of its geographic scope and while divided internally, nonetheless has come to the conclusion, as of last November, that it would be willing to settle for a separate Palestinian state side by side with Israel. Now, you might say, so what? Israel is there, it's been there, it'll be there forever. But in fact, among the Palestinians, until last November, you did not get a consensus, or a majority, I should say, in favor of a two-state solution. That has now been stated. Arafat is stating it regularly on American television, Jim Lehrer and the McNeil Lehrer show. And this has put the PLO in a positive position vis-a-vis American opinion in certain sectors and in terms of international opinion generally. Now, they say one of the things that has caused this shift in the PLO position has been, as I mentioned, the pressures of the Palestinians within the occupied territories, a minority of all the Palestinians, to call for some of those people sitting outside in Tunisia, in Syria and elsewhere, to face up to reality. Israel is a reality. We have to accept it and engage in the peace process. What about the fourth set of players? I've mentioned domestic opinion. I've mentioned the coalition government, the PLO. The Arab states, two of whose leaders were here this month, Mubarak and Hussein, remain very important players on the international scene. That means Egypt, that means Jordan, that means Syria, which was neglected in the early Reagan years, and to a limited degree, Saudi Arabia. At Camp David, we sought to resolve the Palestinian issue through Egypt. It failed because the Carter administration was not able to deliver the Israelis to come to terms with the need for a final settlement. Limited autonomy, yes, but they were unwilling, the Menachem Begin government was unwilling to go toward a final settlement. Then we tried to work through Jordan, and this was particularly true through the Reagan administration. But with the withdrawal of Jordanian influence from the West Bank last summer, we have to recognize that the parties to the dispute have changed. And on the question of, who are the key parties to any dispute, I think some of you may recall a story that's told about the American humorist Robert Benchley, who wrote a number of years ago. And when Robert Benchley was at college, he was asked to write an essay on the U.S.-Canadian fisheries agreement from the point of view of the parties. And Benchley wrote on his examination paper, "I don't want to write about the U.S.-Canadian fisheries agreement from the point of view of the parties. I want to write about it from the point of view of the fish." And in fact, what has happened is what were seen previously as the fish. Golda Meir, within the last 20 years, said there is no such thing as the Palestinians. In fact, the central issue today is not an Arab-Israeli issue, but it is the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and that's the reason I phrased the subject of my remarks tonight in those terms. Not to speak on the Arab-Israeli question, but to speak on the Israeli-Palestinian question, because that is a central issue. This doesn't mean Mubarak, Hussein, possibly Assad can't play important roles, but they are no longer the central players. It is nonetheless important to take account of the views of those three countries, and of course to try to seek some resolution of the Lebanese crisis, given the extraordinary turmoil in that country today and the fact that there's been civil war there since 1975. But we have moved to a new phase. It's not Israel and the surrounding Arab states. We have Israel dealing with the Palestinians. The European Economic Community, let me just say that Arafat has been rather successful in his political and public relations. Earlier this year, he met with a subgroup of the European Economic Community in Madrid, consisting of the foreign ministers of Spain, France, and Greece. There's the report that President Mitterrand of France will meet with Arafat in France and the Europeans can therefore be seen as putting some pressure on Washington, although how much effect that will have either here or on the Israelis remains to be seen. But nonetheless, European opinion is part of the equation. Then there's the Soviet Union. In the early part of the Reagan administration, the President and his Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, saw the Middle East issue essentially through the Cold War prism. They were concerned about Soviet aggrandizement in the Middle East, and it was part of the Cold War philosophy, if you will, of the early Reagan years. That has changed with Gorbachev. It's changed in the sense that the Soviets have accepted Resolution 598, bringing to an end the war in the Gulf. You now have an increase in the release by the Soviet Union of Soviet Jews. There's an opening of a Jewish cultural center in Moscow. There are consular-level talks between Moscow and Jerusalem. And there have been efforts on the part of the Soviet Union to move the Syrians and the PLO toward a more moderate position. So it's quite possible that you will have the resumption of diplomatic relations, in my judgment, between the Soviet Union and Israel, and I think that the Soviet Union will be able to play a constructive role in the peace process, recognizing that their own objectives are not the same as ours. These are the players, as I see it, that the Bush administration will have to deal with. And just by describing them, I think you can get some feeling for the intricacies of the situation. What are the elements of a possible final settlement? The quick answer is no one knows. Certainly I don't. But let me try out some thoughts. First of all, you won't get any peace unless Arafat and the PLO adhere to the three understandings at Geneva. Second, we'll have to move toward a situation in which the Israeli government is willing to accept the territory for peace formula of Resolution 242. I think I'm correct in saying that Yitzhak Shamir is the only prime minister in the world who does not accept 242. It should be noted that the Labor Party within Israel is, in fact, willing to make a territorial compromise, but Likud, up to this point, has not. It is essential to work out an interrelationship between the interim and the final settlement. And that's where the Israeli election proposal, as I say, is regarded with suspicion by the Palestinians. Negotiations may, and I underline may, result in some type of a separate Palestinian state or Palestinian entity, provided Israeli security is unequivocally assured, and that Israel ultimately accepts the PLO and self-determination for the Palestinians. We're a long way from there now. But it seems to me these are two critical factors in a possible solution. What elements might there be in such a solution? You can say this is pipe dreaming, looking this far ahead. But it seems to me that you could have some type of agreement which would bring about arms limitations of some type in the West Bank and Gaza, an arrangement for a confederation between any type of new Palestinian entity and Jordan, open borders between the Palestinian areas and Israel, some type of Benelux arrangement, protection of the Israeli settlers. You've got 60 to 70,000 Israeli settlers, and you're not going to have them pull back from the West Bank the way the Israelis pulled out of the Sinai before it was turned back to Egypt. So the settlers have to be protected, but after all, You've got over 500,000 Palestinian Arabs in Israel today, and certainly a formula can be devised to take care of the 60 to 70,000 Israeli settlers. Some compensation for the Palestinians in the diaspora has to be worked out, and as far as security is concerned, international guarantees are essential, I think, or may be essential. And that might mean a formal security treaty between the United States and the State of Israel, which in my judgment would be quite a satisfactory way to go. All of this seems fanciful, perhaps. Peace may seem impossible. But, you know, who would have predicted 2 years ago in this audience, anybody that would have predicted this will certainly get the award of the year from the Council. Who would have predicted 2 years ago that the Soviets would have withdrawn from Afghanistan, that the Vietnamese would be preparing to withdraw from Cambodia, that a ceasefire would be in effect in the Persian Gulf, that agreement has been reached for the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola and the independence of Namibia, and who would have predicted that the United States would be talking to the Palestine Liberation Organization? The Israeli-Palestinian issue may be more complex than any of the others, but that does not mean that it is not subject to resolution. And in an area of lost opportunities, it seems to me that the Bush administration has an unusual opportunity to move down the path of peace in the Middle East. And let me conclude on that note. If you think I'm perhaps overly optimistic, and maybe I am, it's perhaps an occupational hazard of a diplomat or an ex-diplomat. And in that connection, I remember the words of a man who was not very good at winning presidential elections, but he was a man of extraordinary eloquence. Adlai Stevenson once said that optimism is for diplomats what courage is for soldiers.
The question, I believe, is does the history of Islam justify confidence that she would maintain a long-term promise to Israel about her existence? A, and B, does this, how does this blend or mesh with the mellowing worldview of Islam today?
Well, it was also the Syrian question. Let me just say that I don't think, I think this is not a question of Muslims and Jews or Muslims and Christians. The many members of the Palestine Liberation Organization, of course, are Christians. Some of the leaders of the two of the major factors in the Fatah, in the PLO, as part of the Fatah, George Habash and Hikmat Nawatma, are Christians. So it is not a matter of Palestinian Muslims against Christians or Palestinian Muslims against Jews. Rather, it is a concern of the Palestinians for the territory that they rightly believe is theirs. Unfortunately, that is the same territory that many Jews feel is theirs as well. On the Syrian question, today, part of the tragedy in Syria is, in fact, based on religious lines, and it is partly because the numbers of Christians in Syria, in proportion to the Muslims, have declined over the last 20 years, and yet the Christian elements in Syria, in Lebanon, are seeking to maintain a position of power in the country disproportionate to their numbers. But again, it gets all mixed up. You now have Syria fighting with the Muslim elements in Lebanon. But in fact, the Syrian forces first came into Lebanon in 1976 to fight the Palestinians rather than, in fact, to come in and fight the Christian community, as is the case at the present time. So the pattern has changed over the last 20 years, last 15 years.
What can Mr. Bush do, I believe is the question, to speed up Israeli flexibility on the issue?
It'll be very difficult for Mr. Bush or Secretary Baker for several reasons. One, even though the Israeli elections on November 1 were very closely contested, Prime Minister Shamir and the Likud have strengthened their positions in recent months, including in the municipal elections in Israel. So I would suggest that Shamir is probably as strong as any Likud or Likud government in the last 10 years, and since the Likud came into power in 1977. So there is very little that we can do directly. There's also the feeling of getting involved in Israeli politics with all the problems that that has. There is, however, the honest broker role that we're talking about. There's also the possibility that Mr. Shamir's position, both because of the domestic situation in Israel and the international picture, will change over time. Menachem Begin was the one who gave up the Sinai. Charles de Gaulle was the one who gave up Algeria. Richard Nixon was the man who opened relations with China. Ronald Reagan of the evil empire signed the INF agreement with the Soviet Union. Often somebody who comes from a, quote, conservative position is in a better position to deal internationally than somebody who comes from the left of center, if you will. So I think that there is little that we can do directly, but it seems to me that if in fact a fair set of election proposals are worked out, Shamir will be in a very difficult position to turn down an election proposals if the procedures are seen as fair in Israel and fair in the international community.
Concerning American public opinion, can you compare the resources invested by the American Jewish lobby with those invested by an Arab American lobby?
No, I don't have those figures. I think what is called the Jewish lobby, or AIPAC, has been very, very successful domestically in the United States, and it continues to be successful. It reflects the sincere views of a large number of members of the American Jewish community. But let me add that the Israeli lobby is not just consists of American Jews. There are a number of other people who, quite understandably, are very concerned about the well-being and security of Israel. These people, both the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community, feel very strongly, and properly so, about the security of Israel. In recent years, you have had a growth of in Arab groups, the ADC on the Arab side, National Association with Arab Americans, so that you are having a stronger lobby, if you will, on the Arab side, but the balance in terms of power vis-a-vis the Congress in Washington remains on the side of the Israeli lobby. But I don't have the exact figures.
You're walking out on me. I'm not going to say much, just a little bit. Can you hear me in the back? Area of lost opportunities, I hope, is a historical observation and not, from a confessed optimist, a prophecy. But I think, Chris, that you've given us a cool, objective analysis of a hot, twisty situation. and I wish that President Bush had been here to hear it.